morning. Thank you so much for being here today. This is a beautiful area, by the way. I've never been out here to Oakmont, if you can believe that. I was born and raised in Sonoma County. I've lived in Healdsburg for the last 4 years, and yet this is my first trip out to Oakmont. So thank you for giving me an excuse to come out here and see this beautiful area. So thank you for that introduction, Tom. That was very nice. It was interesting hearing my work covered from so many different angles. I like the way you conceptualize it. So I think Tom did a pretty comprehensive job of telling you who I am and what I do. So I'm not going to talk much about that. What I will tell you is that, as a disclaimer, I'm not an expert in Middle East politics. I do teach international relations and some courses on foreign policy at Sonoma State University, but my areas of interest and expertise tend to be broader and more thematic, so as opposed to regionally based. But that being said, because I work in the field of nonviolent action and civil resistance, both as a scholar and as a consultant and analyst, I know many activists from all over the world, including a number of activists from the recent struggles in Egypt and Iran and Tunisia, Bahrain, and many other places. So to the extent that I'll be able to address any questions about that part of the world and those countries, my knowledge really comes from my work with those activists. So my goal today is to give you a more systematic perspective on a phenomenon that should be familiar, will be familiar to everyone in this room, and to give you some tools for how to analyze that phenomenon as we see these struggles and movements emerging all over the world. And since the focus of today's talk is the Arab Spring, in particular, I'll focus on suggestions for how to think about what's happening in that part of the world. Excuse me, I have terrible allergies right now with this weather, so I may be coughing or sneezing or at least clearing my throat up here. Sorry about that. So it's very difficult to talk about the success or failure of the Arab Spring as a cohesive phenomenon, because each case, each country is totally unique. And so when we look at the phenomenon through the lens of nonviolent action, through the efficacy of nonviolent action, we see that movements in some places, like Tunisia and Egypt and Yemen, places where there have been successful shifts of power, as well as Bahrain and Iran, they tend to have movements that are more organized and more disciplined, but each with very distinctive demands and focuses. Whereas in a place like Libya, there's no nonviolent movement to speak of. So it's very difficult to analyze that case through this lens. In Syria, another difficult case, there is a movement. However, they've had a relatively small role in the events of recent months. And that's just a handful of the cases. There are many other countries and regions where there are movements and struggles also operating with different degrees of organization and efficacy. So what I'm going to do is start with an introduction to the phenomenon. So the term, when I say the phenomenon, I should define what I mean. The term I'll be using primarily in this discussion is nonviolent conflict. But there are many different ways to talk about this phenomenon. So you may hear me refer to it as nonviolent action, or strategic nonviolent action, or strategic nonviolent conflict, for those primarily in academia and to a lesser extent in media who are uncomfortable with the term nonviolent, the term civil resistance has started to gain more popularity, especially for some reason in the UK, although it does refer to the same concept, which is nonviolent action. And then the term people power has been used in different parts of the world to describe the bottom-up phenomenon we're talking about. So all of those terms mean essentially the same thing, and you may hear me using them interchangeably, but for purposes of this first slide, the first part of the discussion, I'm going to identify it as strategic nonviolent conflict. So this phenomenon of strategic nonviolent conflict is something with which all of you are familiar to some extent. You've seen it, maybe you've even witnessed it or participated in it firsthand. But it's a concept and particularly a field of study, of academic study, that's relatively new in terms of our systematic understanding of it. So what is it? Well, nonviolent conflict is the method by which ordinary people mobilize and then fight for their rights or freedoms or to overcome oppression or injustice of some type by using disruptive actions, but without using violence. The concept that's at the heart of nonviolent action is the concept of disobedience. And I'll get to that a little bit more in a minute. But the idea is that any mass action or any mass display of nonviolent action involves organized disobedience. Nonviolent conflict can take many forms. The most well-known form, and the form with which most of us are familiar and that springs to mind when we hear the concept, is protest. This is the form that is covered most often on media, for example, when hundreds of thousands or 500,000 people turn out onto the streets of a country's capital city. But protest is only one form of nonviolent resistance. There's also forms of non-cooperation, organized non-cooperation, which is a slightly more aggressive or assertive type of resistance that might involve things like strikes, mass strikes or boycotts. And then another category that's even more assertive is nonviolent intervention, which actually involves really interrupting the flow of life as normal. So a type of nonviolent intervention, of mass nonviolent intervention, might take the form of something like a blockade. So nonviolent conflict it's an active phenomenon. In fact, I'm going to say it's proactive, that empowers people using it by by uniting them in a vision, a shared vision of the future, and then giving them a shared stake in the outcome of their struggle. Now, in order for those applying nonviolent action or those observing nonviolent action to both understand and effectively use it, we have to revisit and then possibly upgrade our understanding of a few familiar concepts. So the first concept, and actually the most key concept to understanding how nonviolent action really works, is the concept of power, how power really works. Now, when I talk to my students at Sonoma State about the concept of power, the first thing I ask them is, what is it? How does it work? And I inevitably get answers back that say things like, power is something that someone else has that they exert over me. Or power is something that comes from the top somewhere, some entity, government, or a corporation, or some authority that's exerted over them. That's how many of my undergraduates describe the idea of power. In order to understand how nonviolent action works, you have to completely reject that top-down idea of power. See my little arrow there? So if we conceptualize power as power in some sort of society, whatever that is, we can talk about it as a nation state or a community. If we conceptualize it as a pyramid, people tend to think about the rulers sitting at the very top of that pyramid and then exerting power down. I can't walk out of this line, but over the people down there at the bottom. But in fact, I would argue, and I think as would the various activists around the world applying mass nonviolent action, the power is actually a bottom-up phenomenon. And that no ruler or no system, so this can include a government, it can include a corporation, really any organized injustice, none of them can stay in power and continue to do what they do without the consent of the people, either explicit or tacit. So if you're having difficulty with this, and I get resistance to this concept a lot, think about it this way, that if everybody organized and withdrew their consent for a system of injustice, then it would no longer work, right? Let's say, well, I'm going to give you a slightly tongue-in-cheekish example, but there's a group, a movement, I guess, depending on your perspective, called the Tea Party movement in this country. And it has, as one of its biggest priorities, to lower taxes, or in some cases, depending on how extreme the belief system of the individuals involved might be, to end the tax system in the United States. So if you perceive that the tax system in the United States is a burden and an injustice, then this view of power and this sort of organized resistance would say, well, if some plurality of Americans got together and simply organized and refused to pay taxes, it would be very, very difficult for government to enforce that particular law, especially if every single person decided to not pay taxes. Can't throw every single person in jail, right? Sorry?
I said I have a much better example.
Oh, you do? Okay, please. Sure.
Rosa Parks, who in essence initiated not sitting in the back of the bus. I mean, one person, then it was Montgomery, Alabama, then it was the entire South. So it did rise.
It's a great example.
And I think that's a much better example.
It is. I think it's a better example in the sense that it's a better example of nonviolent action.
Yes.
Absolutely. I was trying to think of one that was contemporaneous, but yes, the Rosa Parks example, about resistance of refusing to move to the back of the bus, is a perfect example of disobedience that recognized the inherent power of the individual to either give or not give their consent to a system of injustice. Thank you. Okay, so a second concept about, a second understanding about power that I think we need to address is the idea that power is not monolithic. In waging struggles and resistance against oppressors, many movements will make the mistake of presuming that the entity that they are targeting is one monolithic power that shares, where each individual or organization involved shares interests. But if you understand power as pluralistic, as being spread out and diversified, the application of nonviolent action becomes much more possible. And I'll develop this a bit more in a minute. The third piece that I wanted to mention here is the idea that, well, there's a perception that conflict is bad, and that conflict is somehow unhealthy for democracy or for democratic discourse. And I think you get this a lot if you turn on the news and you hear the commentary about disagreements and debates happening in Congress and amongst political parties and so on. But in fact, conflict is inherently healthy for democracy. In fact, more than that, it's essential to democracy. So if we understand nonviolent action to be the practice of democracy in order to create rights or overcome oppression, then I think a way to conceptualize nonviolent conflict is to understand that we're not talking about movements as resolving conflict. That's not the job of the movement in Egypt. It wasn't to fix an existing conflict. The job of the movement in Egypt was to wage a conflict, but to wage it non-violently. So that's one of the distinctions I want to make between this field of study and this phenomenon and something that it gets confused with a lot, which is a field of conflict resolution. What I do is not conflict resolution. I don't teach people how to do that. I teach people how to engage in a struggle in a way that it respects the integrity of the opponent and uses this bottom-up notion of power in order to achieve victory. So there are a few different dynamics involved in mass nonviolent action that tell us a bit about how it actually shifts power. First of all, through nonviolent action, a broad-based civic movement drives up the cost of repression, and it reduces the economic, political, and moral support that an oppressor needs in order to keep control. Secondly, when people deprive a ruler of their consent, it reduces that ruler's authority. So, in many contexts, including in the various countries of the Arab Spring, the act of simply refusing to be complicit in the lie that the ruler has a right to power can be extraordinarily effective. So just simply not going along with the big lie. And then lastly, once a system's own defenders, and I'll get to this concept in a bit more detail in a minute, but once they begin to doubt whether it can survive, this can be anybody from the security forces to media, to businesses, to courts, and so on. Once that happens, the balance of power begins to shift to those using the civilian-based resistance. And then the movement and the methods, legitimacy increases, opening up space for genuine democracy. Okay, now this photo may be familiar to some of you. It comes from the height of the uprising in Egypt a year ago, February, beginning of February. It's a woman kissing a soldier, an army soldier. And I have a quote here from Hannah Arendt, who, she says, "Where commands are no longer obeyed, the means of violence are of no use." This is the approach that these various movements have taken. They've rejected the idea that violence equals power, first of all. And they understand that when fear no longer works, that the ability to use violence effectively disappears. So this moment represents a key strategy used by Egyptian people and by peoples in many other parts of the world who have applied nonviolent action successfully. The idea was to win over the regime's key loyalists, its pillars of support, those who defended it. And when they're able to win over enough of them, the regime can no longer sustain itself under its own weight. And again, I'll return to that concept again in a second. But I have another quote from this woman, Hannah Arendt, who's was a wonderful political sociologist who's written extensively about the concepts of violence and power. And what she says is that, politically speaking, it's not enough to say that power and violence are not the same. Power and violence are opposites. Where the one rules absolutely, the other is absent. Okay. Now this idea becomes, I think, really salient when we look at key moments, turning points in various struggles. For example, remember, well, now it's been almost 3 years, back in the summer of 2009, when the people of Iran were on the streets defending the election of the challenger to Ahmadinejad, Mousavi, and they were arguing that Ahmadinejad had stolen the election, and they poured out onto the streets to defend and advance the idea of democracy in Iran. And up until the moment of violence, up until the time when the regime cracked down openly and brutally on the people on the streets, that uprising only got minimal coverage. It arguably got lip service coverage from conventional media. But once the regime cracked down and there was blood in the streets and people could see with their own eyes the violence that the regime was using, suddenly it became a very interesting story all over the news. And the way that story tended to be covered and talked about was as though the regime was restoring power. They were restoring normalcy and exerting strength. And the evidence for that was their open use of violence. So what I'm arguing and what Hannah Arendt is arguing is that, in fact, a more accurate understanding of that moment in time would have been to say that was the moment where the regime began to feel so threatened that they were willing to risk their own political legitimacy and moral authority by openly cracking down on their own citizens in front of international cameras. And so this gets at that idea that while we tend to treat violence as an expression of power, in fact, at least as pertains to this phenomenon, the use of violence represents a perceived threat to one's own power. Okay, I know that there's a lot of text up here. Might be difficult for you to read. Don't worry about reading it. I'll go through these quickly. In order to go a little bit deeper with an understanding of what nonviolent action is, I want to address some of the most common misperceptions about what it is, and then correct them, because there are a lot. So I picked out a handful of the ones that I think are probably the most pervasive. And as I go through these, I would ask you to think about how many of these you've either heard or said, possibly perpetuated yourself, about the various uprisings in the Arab Spring. Okay, so the first misconception is that nonviolent action is either inaction, passivity, the avoidance of conflict, or pacifism. It's none of those things. Nonviolent action, according to Gandhi, is the most activist force in the world. So to talk about it as inactive or inaction and passive is oxymoronic. It's also not, as I mentioned earlier, the avoidance of conflict. It involves actively waging conflict, just doing so with nonviolent tools. And then on the last piece, there's a lot of conflating between the perspectives of people who advocate for nonviolent action and those who are pacifists. Pacifism is a principled objection to war in all cases. I know many practitioners of nonviolent action who are absolutely not pacifists. And conversely, I know many pacifists who have never engaged in nonviolent action. So they're two very distinct phenomena. But I think that they tend to get conflated quite a bit in our public understanding. Another misconception is that those who use nonviolent action naively assume that by using nonviolent tools that their opponent won't respond to them violently. Well, that's not true. In fact, organized strategic movements not only do not expect their opponent to respond nonviolently, but they plan for a repressive response. It's built into the strategy. Another misconception is that nonviolent action is used only as a last resort when the tools of violence are unavailable to a movement or a struggle. And that may be the case in a couple of historical examples. But over the last 30 years, where we've seen dozens and dozens of nonviolent movements spring up around the world, the choice to use nonviolent tools has been conscious. And the primary reason for choosing those tools is because ultimately they produce better results. They're really the only way to wage a struggle against an opponent that holds a monopoly on the use of force is to find a skill set that you, as the movement, are superior at, and that involves creative nonviolent actions. Another common misconception is that nonviolent action is determined by things like culture, geography, the economic system, or other structural conditions. A common one that I heard early on during the initial Egyptian uprising is that the Egyptian people, what we're seeing from the Egyptian people either isn't truly nonviolent action, or it's going to quickly decay into violence because, the argument went, either you can pick your poison here, either Arabs or Muslims do not understand nonviolence. that these are inherently violent cultures, and therefore they won't be able to use nonviolent tools to shift power. Again, the long history of case studies over the last, let's say, 120 years or so suggest that, in fact, structural conditions or culture or these other types of variables, these meta-variables, have very little to do with the effectiveness of a nonviolent struggle. What is important is the ability of the movement and of the activists to do things like organize, maintain discipline, create unity, come up with a good strategy, and then implement appropriate tactics in order to achieve their goals. So it's the skills of the individual activists, not the conditions, that's the most important. A similar misconception, and again, I heard this a lot during the days leading up to Mubarak's final moments in power, is the idea that the effectiveness of nonviolent action is a direct result of the either ideology or repressiveness of the opponent. So the argument essentially goes that nonviolent action won't work against extremely brutal regimes or opponents. Again, real-world evidence suggests that actually the converse is true. Some of the world's most successful struggles have taken place in some of the most violent parts of the world and under some of the most brutal tyrants. Milosevic in Serbia, Pinochet in Chile, Marcos in the Philippines, the apartheid system in South Africa, Mubarak in Egypt, and so on. There's also a common perception that participation in nonviolent action, because it has the term nonviolence in it, requires the holding of a certain set of ideological, religious, or even metaphysical beliefs. Specifically, the argument is that if you're not Buddhist, or if you don't adhere to a belief system that advocates, not just Buddhist, possibly Quaker, or any other belief system that adheres to principled nonviolent perspective, that you can't participate effectively in nonviolent action. This is where there's a bit of a distinction between strategic nonviolent action and principled nonviolence. In strategic nonviolent action, anybody can participate, as long as they share an understanding of what the grievance is and who's responsible for fixing it, and that is the people. And then the last misconception I want to address here is that there's a perception that nonviolent campaigns need a charismatic leader, one charismatic leader, in order to succeed. They need a Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. or a Nelson Mandela. Again, in reality, it was those movements where there was just one charismatic leader that actually were the most risky, because where there's one person around whom everybody else's interests and attention is focused, if that person is eliminated somehow, put in jail, or God forbid, worse, then there's a very good chance that the movement will dissolve, either because it's demoralized or because it loses the ability to strategize effectively. So in virtually every other contemporaneous movement where there is not just one charismatic leader, what you have are lines of leadership, layers of leadership, where individuals are able to strategize and maintain nonviolent discipline and so on. And those are the cases that actually tend to be more successful. So it's the cases of the Gandhis, the Kings, and the Mandelas of the world are actually the exceptions to the rule. while I'm talking about misconceptions, I added this slide in last night because, as Tom mentioned, I also work a bit on media criticism and political communication. And one of the things I'm working on now is a book on how civil resistance is covered in media. So I take these misconceptions that I just talked about, and then I go one level deeper to look at how media coverage of nonviolent action around the world taps into what I call meta frames, which is just kind of a fancy way of saying widespread and deeply held beliefs. And many times, our meta frames, these beliefs that we hold about concepts like violence and power, are unconscious to us. So what I argue is that without us really even recognizing it, a lot of the media coverage that we tend to get about nonviolent action tends to reinforce these things, these beliefs, that are not only questionable, maybe wrong even, but they're potentially problematic for the success of nonviolent struggles around the world because they run the risk of undermining the morale of the activists themselves. So let me give you a couple of quick examples. The first gets at that example I mentioned a few minutes ago about the Iran uprising in the summer of 2009. The first is that repression is more interesting than resistance. So again, if you look at the trajectory of media coverage of uprisings, you'll see that media coverage peaks when there is an incidence of brutality or violence. And this is not, by the way, unique to the coverage of nonviolent action. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. We know that media loves to sensationalize and cover violence because it's a good way to sell their product to their audience. But the problem is, in this context, as related to this phenomenon, that runs the risk of suggesting to the larger audience that it's not the resistance of the people, despite the repression, that's important, but that somehow it's the repression itself that's interesting. But think about that for a second. What's really interesting or surprising about the fact that Ahmadinejad and the Guardian Council cracked down on the people of Iran, or that Mubarak cracked down on the people of Egypt? Neither of those things should be particularly surprising, because that's what they do. That's what those regimes do. What is, I think, arguably more interesting, and if not more interesting, at least more important, is that people continue to turn out on the streets of Cairo and Tehran, risking their lives, despite the fact that these regimes were cracking down. So that's one metaframe, this belief that it's that moment of violence that's interesting. It's really that moment of people coming back that's more interesting. Another and related metaframe is the idea that violence or force is the most powerful way of waging a conflict. This is what we tend to default to. And again, we see this all the time in media coverage. And I think, in studying this now for a couple of years, I really would argue that, for the most part, this is not intentional on the part of journalists. I think that it reflects possibly a little bit of journalistic laziness, but more likely it reflects the propensity to fall back on these common assumptions or frames. So this is why when a regime cracks down, when Mubarak cracked down on the people of Egypt, CNN and MSNBC and Fox covered it as Mubarak exerting strength. Or Mubarak's regime engages in a show of power. So what I would suggest to you is that you pay very close attention to the language that's used to describe the phenomenon that you're witnessing. And especially now in light of this conversation and this presentation that we're having today, if you can observe as you're watching the news and hearing these stories, think about this notion of power that I've introduced as a bottom-up concept, and the idea that the use of violence in the face of that power actually represents a perceived position of weakness rather than a perceived position of strength. And if you can do that, I think that you'll begin to absorb the information, process this information about these stories a bit differently. Another common metaframe is something I've already addressed, which is the idea that power is top-down rather than bottom-up. An interesting way that this comes up in media coverage is how sources in news stories are almost always authority figures. It's very rare that even in the context of a mass movement where there are hundreds of thousands of activists on the ground, it's very rare that you get an interview with or a perspective from a person who's actually engaged in that action in the middle of Tahrir Square in Cairo in that moment. Instead, it's the information minister of the Egyptian regime who's asked to weigh in on what's happening on the ground. Well, the job of any information minister in any government is propaganda. So they're simply going to tell you their interpretation, their interests as their interpretation of what's happening on the ground. So they're going to say, oh, those people are terrorists. They're secretly using violence. Or they'll say they are backed by the CIA, or the United States government orchestrated this, or they're agent provocateur. Who knows? But the more authentic version of events would come from people who are actually engaged in the action on the ground. So pay attention to that when you hear these stories about uprisings around the world. You'll see that it's almost always those figures, those authority figures at the top, who are asked to contextualize that information for you, and they're the ones that have the most suspect interests and probably the least sophisticated understanding of what's really going on. And then the other two also get at concepts I discussed earlier, that power is monolithic rather than pluralistic, and that reinforces the earlier one about power being top-down. And again, the notion that conflict is undesirable. And I think that this comes up a lot in a problematic way in media coverage about nonviolent action, in that there's often a hinting on the part of media that those who are openly waging a challenge to an established system, even if that system is corrupt or unjust, that they are creating problems, that they're troublemakers because they're provoking conflict. But what someone like Václav Havel, from the first president of the newly democratic Czech Republic, what he would say is that it's those people who are just bringing the hidden tension to the surface. It already exists. They're just bringing it out. Okay, this is just a quick primer on nonviolent strategy. And I think this may help you understand what you saw happening in Egypt and in Tunisia and elsewhere in terms of tactics. There's a concept called pillars of support idea that's used by nonviolent movements and activists everywhere. It has different names in different places, but it's essentially the same thing. The idea behind pillars of support is that no system of injustice or no tyranny can stay in power on its own. It needs help. It needs support from organizations, institutions, and various groups across society. So those organizations and institutions and groups that help a tyrant or a system of injustice stay in place are called the pillars of support. So let's pretend like this diagram up here represents Mubarak's regime. And instead of saying injustice at the top, it says Mubarak. Okay? So what the people of Egypt did in order to remove Mubarak from power was they identified a series of pillars of institutions and organizations that helped keep Mubarak in place. And then they systematically targeted those. So examples would be media, the court system, universities, and then security forces, police and the military. Okay, there were many more, but those were four of the most important in the Egyptian case. Now, the job of a movement is to weaken these pillars to the extent that they can no longer sustain themselves. Okay? Now you saw the arrows kind of pulling away from the pillars. That's actually important. The idea behind a pillar of support strategy is that movements target individuals within those pillars, because those are all people, human beings, filling those positions. They target them by pulling them out rather than pushing on them. Okay, so what this metaphor means is that instead of aggressively assaulting police officers or military officers or judges who are helping to uphold a tyrannical regime, movements instead, and because, by the way, that just girds their support. That girds their loyalty to the tyrant. Instead, movements approach those individuals and then offer them something in order to pull them out. Okay? And that offering of something can take all kinds of different forms. They can try to win them over on the basis of their argument, that they have a more persuasive cause. They can try and win them over on the grounds that the system is going to be eliminated eventually anyway, that Mubarak is going to be forced out of power. Do you want to go down with him? In a lot of cases, members of the security forces are pulled out of pillars by their own kids. Because in a lot of these movements, as you know, a big portion of activists are young people, college-age students primarily. And these members of the security forces, these military and police officers, do not want to be in a position where they're asked to choose between disobeying the order of someone like Mubarak or shooting at their own kids. So this has to be done in a very nuanced way, and it's something that it's difficult to get into in a lot of depth here. But this idea of neutralizing or winning over security forces is critical to the success of every single one of the nonviolent movements that you've been watching on the news and the Arab Spring, but also in other parts of the world. Without being able to do that, these movements can't win. So when enough individuals, rank-and-file soldiers or police officers, within the pillars have withdrawn their support, then the policy or system can no longer sustain itself. And by the way, the withdrawing of support doesn't have to take the form of open subordination, which can be very dangerous in some contexts. There are great stories that come out of some of these struggles where, like for example in Serbia in 2000 when Otpor was leading a nonviolent resistance against Milosevic, they tell the story of how on that final day, when there were about 1 million people out in the central Square in Belgrade, demanding that Milosevic step down, and he acknowledged the election results. Milosevic, in a last-ditch effort to hold on to power, had ordered some of his military helicopters to drop tear gas into the crowds down there on the streets in front of their parliament building. And there were about half a dozen helicopter pilots that day who radioed back to their commanders that they were unable to carry out their missions because they couldn't see the target because it was too foggy that day. So they just had to go back home. And turns out, if you go look up the weather report for October 5th, 2000, in Belgrade, it was a completely blue sky that day. So this was an example of how, in this case, these particular members of the security forces, pillars of support to Milosevic's regime, weren't quite ready to openly rebel against him, but they had begun to find ways to stop carrying out his orders. And that only happened because in that year leading up to October 5th, 2000, the movement in Serbia had done such an extraordinary job of pulling these individuals out of these pillars systematically and winning them to their side. Let's see what time it is. Okay, so it is almost 11:30. I'm going to talk for about 5 or 10 more minutes, and then I'll open it up for questions. I'm guessing that this probably goes without saying for most of you in this audience, but this isn't common knowledge for everyone engaged in struggles. So I'm going to mention the importance of nonviolent discipline in a movement, and the necessity for a movement to be able to ensure that its participants, that its activists, stay completely nonviolent, even in the face of extreme provocation or repression. Okay? And the reason I think this, by the way, is particularly relevant and topical right now in our context is because you may have heard about the Occupy Wall Street struggle movement. One of the really key issues being debated by leaders in that movement, I'm a little hesitant to call it movement at this point, but in that struggle, is this question of the need for nonviolent discipline. There are some activists within the Occupy organization that argue that in some cases, violence may be necessary. There's very few that advocate violence against human beings, but they talk about property destruction and sabotage and those kinds of things. And so this is a both theoretical and tactical debate that's happening in real time right now in the Occupy struggle. It also came up, of course, in every single struggle within the Arab Spring. So I just want to mention it here that there's no way to win a nonviolent struggle without maintaining 100% nonviolent discipline. There's no way. And here's a list of reasons why. And this, by the way, is something I've tried to convey repeatedly to members of Occupy, sometimes with a lot of pushback and resistance. Most of the time, the argument has been received pretty well. But the first reason for using nonviolent discipline is that it removes legitimacy from the oppressor. When you have a movement that's 100% committed to using nonviolent means, and everyone knows that they're 100% committed to using nonviolent means, and then the opponent comes along and uses violence against them anyway, it becomes very hard for even loyalists of that regime or system to support that action. Which is why, by the way, regimes try to justify that violence by calling activists terrorists or accusing them of using violence first, which of course is what Mubarak did, and what we see in essentially every case. Relatedly, maintaining nonviolent discipline gives moral authority to the movement. So one thing that I always tell movements is, it is essential that a movement be more ethical than the entity that it's challenging. Okay? Because if you're not more ethical, what are you doing? What's the point? Right? So this kind of gets at one of the other points here, which is the fact that means and ends are inseparable. This is another key principle of nonviolent strategy, is that the means have everything to do with the ends that you produce. Martin Luther King wrote about this extensively in a letter from a Birmingham jail. And Gandhi, of course, had written about and talked about this extensively as well. The idea is that you cannot create just results from unjust means. So anything that's won through violence has to be maintained through violence. And so if you're thinking about a movement as an attempt to improve on the status quo, to make life more democratic, more fair, more free, and more humane for people, then using violence to achieve those ends defeats the purpose. Using nonviolent discipline also allows for recruitment and an expansion of the movement. Okay? Here's why. People are not won over by violence. It alienates people. So if there's somebody sitting on the sidelines, watching a movement, challenging an oppressor, and they're trying to decide whether or not they want to become involved, watching that movement use violence is going to be it's very unlikely, with short of, there's a small group of people to whom this may appeal, but for most people, that will turn them off. They'll leave. So nonviolent discipline is also strategic in this way, because it allows a movement to continue to grow and expand, which is essential to its success and efficacy. Another point is one that I mentioned a little bit earlier when I was talking about Hannah Arendt. In a nation-state level conflict, where you have a group of civil society confronting a Mubarak, let's say, the state's capacity for the use of violence is always superior. They have more guns, they have more tanks, they have more weapons, they have more money, they have more of everything. So, no matter how creative the use of violence becomes, and by the way, this is where terrorism begins to intersect with this concept, there is no way to directly confront a state opponent using their strength, which is violence, and win. It's a losing proposition from the beginning. Something else that I continuously try to convey to activists. Oh, there's a little typo there. I said state capacity for violence is superior, and then in parentheses, movement can win. It should say movement can't win against a state where their capacity for violence is superior. Another argument here is that the use of violence, regardless of who's engaging in it, expands the suffering of everybody, and it prolongs the struggle. So there are a number of cases historically where there was a nonviolent movement that waged a struggle and it was successful. But then in the background, there had been what's called a radical flank, a violent faction kind of hidden behind it, advocating for the use of violence, always distinct from the nonviolent movement. And then what happens is that with historical hindsight, analysts will say, well, the ANC in South Africa would not have succeeded. I'm sorry, not the ANC, that was Freudian. So the UDF, the nonviolent movement in South Africa, would not have succeeded unless the ANC had been behind it, threatening the use of violence. Okay, I've heard the same case about the U.S. civil rights movement. I've heard the same case about the Philippines, about the movements in Chile, Serbia, and elsewhere. But what veterans of those struggles have said repeatedly is that those other campaigns, those violent campaigns operating behind them or off to the side of them, made the job of the movements much more difficult. And it made that struggle take much longer than it should have. And in fact, if this is a subject of interest to you, I have a friend, a colleague at Rutgers named Kurt Schock, who is writing a book now on this subject. It's called The Radical Flank Effect. So he's doing a very large and systematic empirical study of this question. And I believe his book will be out at the end of this year. So this is something that comes up in movements a lot. And then relatedly, something that a lot of I've heard Occupy activists use, a term, they either use mixed strategies or diversity of tactics, which are ways of saying, sprinkling a little bit of violence in with your nonviolence. And I argue, as do many others, that there is no such thing as mixed strategies or diversity of tactics. That once violence of any form is used by a movement, it's no longer a nonviolent struggle. And you can't put that genie back in the bottle. Okay, the empirical record. So this is just a bunch of data essentially saying that the empirical record over the last 45 years is on the side of nonviolent action over armed insurrection in terms of who's better able to confront tyrants and regime opponents. And my friends Eric Chenoweth and Maria Stephan produced a book last year called Why Civil Resistance Works. And the entire book is dedicated to comparison of armed struggles versus nonviolent struggles over the last 20 years. And what they find, amongst other things, is that nonviolent movements are successful more than twice as frequently as armed struggles. And the other thing, by the way, that's great about, in terms of results, nonviolent movements versus violent movements, is they have a much lower risk of what's called backsliding, or democratic backsliding, where 10 years after the power shift, in cases where nonviolent means were used to win, the odds are that that new system, nonviolently installed system, is still in place, whereas 10 years after an armed insurrection, the odds are that that new system is no longer in place and has been replaced by yet another oppressive system. Okay, so evaluating the Arab Spring through the lens of strategic nonviolent conflict. These are just general questions that I want to pose, and actually want to ask you to pose when you are evaluating what's happening in the countries of the Arab Spring. The first one is whether we see both obstructive program and constructive program in these struggles. Let me touch on that. Gandhi talked about two different phases of movements or of struggles. The first phase he called obstructive program, and that's where the movement finds a way to disrupt the flow of life as normal. Okay, it upsets the status quo using these nonviolent but disruptive actions in order to stall business as usual. Okay, so that's where you see strikes, boycotts, blockades, various other actions. Those are all obstructions. But the other part, the other phase of a struggle, he called constructive program. And this is where the movement has to define and articulate an alternative vision of the future for the people. Okay, so it involves creating potentially new institutions, new policy, new laws, new processes, new ways of doing things. And it's the second piece, this constructive program piece, that is much more difficult and much less frequently seen in contemporaneous struggles. This is the one, for example, that the Egyptian movement is now struggling with. Their obstructive program was clear and successful. And then once Mubarak was gone from power, the movement looked around and realized they now had to scramble to find a way to create something new so that the system didn't continue to perpetuate itself with the new Mubarak. The second question is where do we see genuine movements? And by this I'm getting at the distinction between movements and disorganized groups of people who are engaging in spontaneous acts of protest, which is essentially what happened in the Libya case. Sometimes this can be very difficult to learn, to know the difference by using the mainstream media coverage that we get in this country. In order to really be able to identify this, I suggest branching out with your media sources. Al Jazeera from Qatar is very good, very comprehensive media network that does a lot of investigative journalism, and they're available online. So investigate the struggles and discover if there really is a movement in place or if what you're seeing is spontaneous acts of protest, because those two things will produce very different results. I also would ask you to think about what standard is the effectiveness of nonviolent conflict being measured against? Is it being measured against the effectiveness of violence, which has one possible advantage that I can see, which is that it tends to produce quicker results, or at least it's perceived to produce quicker results. If you look at the difference between how long, let's see, what was it, 9 years in Iraq that the United States has had a military presence in Iraq versus the about 3 to 4 years that it took the Egyptian people to overthrow Mubarak nonviolently. Okay, at least in that particular comparison, nonviolent action seems to have a slightly better record of producing quicker results. But the conventional wisdom is that violence produces better results. Faster results. But if they're faster, does that mean they're better? And that's one of the questions I would ask you to think about. I would also ask you to think about what are the results so far? Is the struggle over or is it ongoing? How is power shifted? There's a tendency, once the leader leaves power, to talk about that struggle as being ended. But in the case of Egypt, as I mentioned a minute ago, that's just the beginning. So it's a bit disingenuous and I think unfair to Egyptian activists to look at the situation today and say, oh, that movement didn't succeed because they're still dealing with violence and conflict and various problems that have not been resolved. That's because that struggle continues. And then I would also ask, how has the phenomenon been misunderstood? And I refer you back to those various misconceptions I mentioned earlier. And what are the consequences of misunderstanding? And then lastly, and I'll finish after this slide, I just want to talk about 5 specific misconceptions that emerged in media about the struggle in Egypt. In order to understand the gap between what we're hearing in terms of media coverage and then what people on the ground, how they actually see things, we have to look at the distinction between the ways in which media is covering these phenomena and the ways in which activists would have the phenomenon covered. So these are the five most common misconceptions about what happened in Egypt. The first is that it was spontaneous. Most media covered the uprising in Egypt as though it just one day happened. That people just woke up one day and had hit their tolerance. They'd hit their ceiling for tolerance, and that's it. We're going out on the streets today. That's kind of a romantic version, but in reality, that movement in Egypt had been planning that action that was launched in the middle of January of 2011 for at least 3 years. So what you saw was the culmination of many, many months of planning and of implementing other tactics behind the scenes. But in media coverage, because they lacked context, we were given the perception that the Egyptian people just woke up one day and got angry. And the problem with saying it's spontaneous is then that by definition you're saying it's not systematic or strategic. And non-strategic, non-systematic movements cannot win. There's also the misconception that it was a military coup, that it was actually the army that overthrew Mubarak. Again, that was not true. In fact, it was quite the opposite in the sense that what that movement had done was very effectively win military, rank-and-file soldiers over to their side by applying that pillars of support principle. And so, had they not been able to do that effectively, Mubarak would not have left power. He would have seen no threat to his hold on power. So, while we did see military playing a role, they did not orchestrate or implement those actions. Another common misconception is that it was orchestrated by the United States. This is one of the conspiracy theories. Starting to get tired. Conspiracy theories perpetuated by Mubarak, and it happens in every single struggle, where once the people begin to be effective, the tyrant blames it on the United States. Now, this is not to say, by the way, that U.S. agencies did not have an interest in being involved or in pushing this along. And it's not to say that they didn't actually approach Egyptian activists with this request. But the Egyptian people rejected it. They didn't want the United States involved. They didn't want the CIA or the NED or the AEI or any other organization with a 3-letter acronym involved in their struggle, because they knew that it would remove their legitimacy. It would create this perception that it wasn't truly indigenous, and then that would demoralize the population at large and really truly put them in danger. Another common misconception is that it was an Islamist uprising. In fact, the uprising in Egypt was about rights. It's about democracy. There are many Muslims involved in that struggle, but there are also Christians, and there are Buddhists, and there are atheists, and every possible cross-section of society is involved in the democratic struggle in Egypt. There are Islamist groups in Egypt, some of whom, like the Muslim Brotherhood, who have benefited from the victory. But there's a lot of misconceptions about the Muslim Brotherhood, actually. They're not a terrorist organization like they're painted in Western media. They're, to a large extent, for Egyptians, the Muslim Brotherhood is a community service organization. They provide daycare services and hot lunches and things like that. In any case, it was not Islamist. There were Muslims involved, but the demands of the movement were secular demands. They had nothing to do with Islam. And then the last misperception about Egypt that I want to mention is that it wasn't nonviolent, because there were some examples of things like rock throwing, and in some cases there were actual fights where between activists and members of the security forces, where regime defenders did get killed. But in each of those cases, those were individuals who had not been trained in nonviolent strategy, who had joined the movement spontaneously, and who had not been taught or exposed to the idea of nonviolent discipline. So the movement didn't endorse or encourage any of those actions, and in fact, they went to great lengths to try and minimize them. And whenever they knew about somebody engaging in any kind of violence or even threatening violence, they would draw a line of demarcation between that person and them. What I would suggest is try and look at it this way. Think about the lengths to which Mubarak went to try and provoke violence amongst activists. There were agent provocateurs everywhere, and as you know, he and his regime engaged in some pretty severe repression. And given the lengths that he went to try and provoke violence, in a country as large, and with a movement as large as that, I think it's frankly remarkable that we saw as little violence as we did amongst the movement. Okay, I'm running out of time. I do have a couple more things to say, but I'm going to hold them to questions if you have them, because I want to give you an opportunity to ask some questions. So thank you for listening to me. Sorry I talked a little longer than planned.
We're going to have only 5 minutes for questions, so questions?
One specific area that you didn't touch on, I'd like you to see if you comment on, with regard specifically to nonviolent confrontation in the Arab Spring, is the what do you see was the specific role of women?
Oh,
as opposed to because you know what most of these people think of women.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think, first of all, the idea that Arabs and Muslims, on the whole, have little regard for the rights of women is another. It's actually another misconception. I talk about it in other presentations and in other contexts. This isn't to say that there isn't little regard for women in some of these places and among some segments of the population. But in fact, in Egypt, in Iran, in Bahrain, in Yemen, women were the key strategists and the key tacticians in every single one of these struggles. And there are strategic reasons for this. Women command a certain type of reverence amongst some segments of society, and because they do, it makes their involvement more powerful, more salient. When people see a group of Egyptian women or of Iranian women out on the streets demanding rights, despite the fact that the regimes are going to be much harder on them than on men, it emboldens other people to turn out onto the streets and to begin, for them to think about risking their own safety in order to join the struggle. In fact, in the case of Iran, which I only briefly mentioned, the movement in Iran, it's a democracy movement, but first and foremost, it's a women's rights movement. The democracy movement has spun off from the women's movement. And the prominent figure in Iran is a woman named Shireen Ebadi, who is, she's a Nobel laureate and a human rights attorney who defends women who have been charged with crimes by the regime. And she uses strategy brilliantly. What she does is the regime will accuse a woman who's been out on the street getting signatures. They'll arrest them and then bring them in and say that they're charged with apostasy. And then Sharina Badi will come before the judge. She'll come before the court. She'll say, how does the fact that this woman does not want her husband to have 3 other wives, how does that convince the United States to attack Iran? Because this is the case that the judges are making. They're engaging in apostasy. It's threatening the security of the state, and therefore they need to be jailed. So she uses both Islam and law to defend women who have been charged with crimes against the state, and mostly very, very successfully. But women have been very, very integral in every single one of these struggles. In fact, a woman from Yemen, an activist from Yemen, shared the Nobel Peace Prize this year with 2 women from Liberia. But I personally know more activists that are women from Egypt and Tunisia. Actually, from every single one of the cases that I've mentioned today, I know more women than men.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation, and we'll see you